In this next series of recordings, I'm going to show how to get started doing stuff with text in 3D. So I'll do 4 different examples. One showing just basic how to position and work with layers in 3D space. And then another showing how to use the per character 3D feature to animate individual letters in 3D space, how to deal with pre-comps containing 3D layers, creating 3D groups, and then lastly, how to make use of the Cinema 4D or advanced 3D render engines to do volumetric extruded 3D text. So let's go ahead and get started. I'll make a new project. And for the first demonstration here, I'm just going to call it 3D text. And I'll start by creating a text layer. I can choose layer, new text if I want my text to be centered in the composition frame. I'm going to just type in 3D text and use the character or properties panel to style the text. So Arial bold. Let me bring my tracking value back down. I'm going to turn on the faux bold option to make my text even bigger, and I'll go ahead and size it up a bit. Okay, great. Now, the basic idea here with 3D layers is you click the 3D switch right there to enable 3D compositing for your layers. And you have 3 different render engine choices here: Classic 3D, Advanced 3D, and Cinema 4D renderer. If you're just working with flat layers in 3D space, stay with the Classic 3D renderer. That is the least demanding on your processor. But if you're doing any kind of 3-dimensional extrusion or creating 3D objects with the new 3D primitive tools, or extruding shape layers or anything like that, as I'll be showing in some future lessons, then you'll use the Advanced 3D or Cinema 4D render engines, and I'll explain the difference between those a little later in the course. But for dealing with flat layers, the Classic 3D renderer is the place to be. Now, when we click that 3D switch, all of our transform properties get broken out into 3 dimensions. So you're no longer limited to just X and Y dimensions for your basic transformation properties. And your rotation property actually gets broken out into 4 separate properties: an orientation property with different X, Y, and Z angles, and then individual X, Y, and Z rotation values, so you can spin your layer around on any of its 3 axes. Now you'll notice also the red, blue, and green controls on the anchor point of the layer to be able to rotate or move or scale on an individual, whoops, that's not scale, but if you can find the little block, there is a scale option there. Anyway, point being, these controls here let you, move or rotate or scale using the individual X, Y, or Z axes. Now, if you click just elsewhere on the layer, you can basically rotate or scale or move on 2 of the 3 axes that you can see. Okay, or in the case of the rotation here, I can rotate on all 3 axes. Now, as I do that, you can see the orientation values here changing. So by default, the rotation tool is affecting orientation for the 3D layer, but you could change that in the options up top if you wanted it to affect the rotation properties instead. Now, I'm going to go ahead and just reset my layer back, though, by clicking the reset option, because I don't want it to be at a random angle. And for this first demonstration, what I'm going to do is create basically a 3-dimensional square of text. So I'm going to duplicate this layer 3 more times. I'm going to hit Command D and duplicate it, so I have a total of 4 text layers for the 4 sides of my square. Now, when we're working in 3D space, we want to make use of the 3D view pop-up menu, which if you don't see it, you may need to enlarge your composition viewer panel. And what you want to see here is this pop-up menu right there where it says active camera, and also the pop-up menu next to it where it says one view, because this is how you can change your view of the 3D layers. So if I wanted to look at them, say, from the top or from the side, I certainly could. This group of views are what we call orthogonal views or right angle views. And then you also have what's called your custom views. And they're called custom views because, of course, you can customize the angle of view. By default, it's high left, high center, and high right. But if you take the orbit tool up here in the toolbar and then click and drag, you can customize the view and it'll remember that view. You can have up to 3 custom views. So this is useful when you're first laying out your layers. The view that matters the most, though, is your active camera view. That is the view that gets rendered. Now, in a later lesson, I'm going to show how to work with camera layers and how we can create interesting camera effects and stuff. But by default, without a camera layer, the active camera view is the front view. Okay, so what I want to do is create a square of these words in 3D space, right? The square of these layers in 3D space. I could try doing that by moving them one at a time and rotating them and stuff, but I want to show you a cool trick that makes it pretty easy. And this is actually going back to one of my earlier lessons in the series where I show how to use anchor point and rotation to create 3D, to create animation. In this case, I'm going to do it in 3D. So if I select my layers and hit A for anchor point, and then use the Z anchor point value, see what happens there? I can move the text away on the depth axis from its anchor point. See, the blue arrow is the Z axis, and that points out from the front of the layer. So that is your depth axis. So I'm going to put these at 500 pixels out in front of their anchor point. Now I'll hit the rotation property, hit R for rotation, and one layer at a time, I'm going to go through, and on the Y-axis, I'm going to rotate one of them 90 degrees, one of them 180 degrees, and the last one here 270 degrees. And leaving the other one at 0 for the Y rotation. So now basically I have a square. Now let me select them all again, hit A for anchor point again, and let me pull the anchor point Z value back in a bit so it's a little bit of a tighter square. There we go, that looks pretty cool. Now if I grab the orbit tool up here in the toolbar, because I'm in this custom view here, let me get this message out of the way. I'm in this custom view, so if I use the orbit tool, I can orbit around and look at the 3D object that I've basically just created. But like I said a moment ago, the active camera view is the view that will get rendered. So what I would like to do is, rotate this square around and maybe tilt it or do something interesting with it. So I want to introduce a technique when we're working with 3D layers, a technique for being able to control the whole group of layers without having to pre-compose. And this is using a null object. If we go to Layer, New, Null Object. A null object layer is just an invisible little square, kind of a dummy layer, but it gives us a new layer that we can use to control other layers by linking. Now by default, here if I go back to my custom view, or back to the, actually if I go to custom, and now notice the null object's not being affected here because it's still a two-dimensional layer. I got to click the 3D switch if I want it to be in 3D, space here. Okay, now you can see the null object is in the center of the scene. So I didn't move it. right? I just created a null object and clicked the switch, and by default, it's in the center of the scene. If I go to the top view, you can, and zoom out here, you can see the same thing. There's the text layers around the perimeter. There's the null object in the center. Now, point I'm getting at here is if I select the text layers, go to my parent and link column, and link them all to that null object, now I can use the null object to control the whole group. So if I show rotation for the null object, for example, and set a couple keyframes for Y rotation, maybe have this thing spin around 1 revolution. I'll set the end of the work area by hitting the N key. And go ahead and preview, and you can see that the whole group rotates around the null object in the center because all the text layers are linked to the null object. Now let me go back to my active camera view because, like I said, that's the view that gets rendered. So maybe I take that null object and tilt it forward a bit on the x-axis. All right, and so you can see how I can control the entire group using the null. If I want to scale it down, for example, I can use the null object to scale the whole group down. I can still animate the individual text layers, but I can use the null object to control the entire group. Okay, so main takeaway here though was clicking the 3D switch for layers enables 3D compositing for those layers, the classic 3D render engine for working with flat layers in 3D space, and being able to rotate, position, and scale the layers in 3D. And then also introducing the concept of adding a null object as a controller when we're building things out of multiple layers in 3D space. In the next demonstration, I'm going to take this a step further by showing how we can animate the individual letters of our text layers in 3D space.